Good evening. I'm Cecilia Bastos, a fellow researcher here at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences. So before explaining my research, I'd like to say a few words about my academic trajectory. When I started being a yoga practitioner, at that occasion, it was only about postural yoga. And I was intrigued about what people say about India. It was the way they say it, their eyes brightened up, like they were amazed by the place. And this got me thinking about doing research with them, asking why India was so special. At that occasion, I was doing my PhD thesis and started to interview these travelers who were in search of spirituality in India. And later on, my professors told me these travelers were not sociologically qualified to be the object of my study because they were not from the same country, they are not from the same age group, they are traveling in different regions in India. But my experience in India was not going to be thrown away, as they could be part of a preliminary research on spirituality in India. And then, after coming back from India, I met a group of Vedanta students and yoga practitioners who could be considered sociologically qualified. They are a regular group of students who meet weekly to study the Upanishads. They traveled to India together as a group in what they called a pilgrimage. I ended up doing field work with them for more than 10 years, participating in their weekly studies and activities. They study Vedic texts such as the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads in a non-profit cultural association called Vidya Mandir, in which class is given by Professor Ariera takes place. Seen as a master or guru, Ariera learned traditional Advaita Vedanta in India from Swami Dayananda. She lived in Dayananda's ashram in the 70s for 4.5 years. Since her return to Brazil, she has dedicated her time to teaching about a life of yoga at Vidya Mandir in Rio de Janeiro. The group of approximately 200 students is wide varied, consisting of university professors, university students, retirees, psychologists, filmmakers, engineers, chefs, entrepreneurs, astrologers, biologists, therapists, translators, philosophers, writers, dermatologists, designers, among others. It should be clear that the interlocutors are not only yoga and meditation practitioners, but have also been studying Sanskrit and Vedanta texts with the guru. They study for a relatively long period. Each Upanishad course is about 3 to 4 years long. Thus, most of the long-time students could be considered experts. They are considered by fellow practitioners as having a deeper understanding of yoga and Vedanta than beginners or casual practitioners. There is a large presence of yoga and meditation teachers, many of whom carry out other professional activities as a means of income support, in addition to teaching. All of them participate in other groups of practices, some even as yoga teachers, who look to Vidya Mandir as a source of learning to pass on to their own students. Some practitioners have taken at least one trip to India with the aim of deepening their learning on yoga. So living a few months or years in an ashram is deemed essential to experiencing and assimilating the teachings while immersed in Indian culture. Nearly all of them have a university degree, and therefore they are inserted in the context of the urban middle classes. In the group, there are people of different beliefs, but most of them consider themselves non-religious or Hindus. Ariera teaches that the knowledge of Vedanta is beyond any religious belief in the sense that it can be taught exclusively as philosophy. But it becomes clear that after a few years of study, most practitioners actively attempt to embody a yogic lifestyle. A few even come to see themselves as Hindus. This means that some of the long-term students end up developing an inclination to embody a Hindu spirituality in the sense of living according to what they call a life of yoga. Still, Hindus or not, the most revealing transformation they undergo is not a physical change, but a change in worldview and lifestyle. According to the Vedanta taught at Vidya Mandir, the acquisition of knowledge brings a fresh view to negative situations. This is crucial to one's emotional maturation and is viewed as a basis for overcoming suffering. From this perspective, the yogi is understood as someone who tries not to be dominated by a pattern of reaction and who seeks to acquire the ability to hold on to impulses and desires. Someone who tries to understand mistakes as opportunities to grow in order to have a mind that has gone through a process of questioning. Most interlocutors have as their goal the practices of austerity and simplicity. They strive to live a life of yoga in their best possible ways. This means developing quite valuable qualities, such as being calm, simple, and above all, having discernment. What does it mean? Yeah? To have discernment for them, of course, would be knowing which attitude would best fit in accordance with one's dharma. Dharma is doing what is correct or appropriate in each situation, or what will be one's duty. Yoga for the group means to unite, to integrate the mind into actions. So what one thinks must be integrated with what one speaks and how one acts. Thus, living a life of yoga is trying to constantly perform this exercise. But it's necessary to highlight that they strive to practice these disciplines as an ideal to be conquered, as a process in which they observe their actions to gain self-knowledge. Historically, modern yoga blossomed from an initial globalization being both Western and Neo-Hindu. This globalized process brought together a bricolage of elements of medical therapy, Hindu asceticism, a type of military gymnastics, and a new style of physical conditioning combined with breathing. This diversity does not only imply the existence of different traditions and worldviews, but involves a relativization in which the bricolage makes sense to the practitioner. A creative movement of embodying values and esoteric elements is described in different techniques and rituals. Those are interpreted by each practice and by the uses and meanings attributed by them. Amid shared performances, these techniques introject values that are built in reference to the body. The fact of paying attention to each action performed and each thought directed to that action points to a dimension of the knowledge of the mind. From these, new configurations of body construction emerge, in which subjectivity is emphasized. Practitioners turn to yoga not only because they believe it is good for health, but because it consists of a process of self-transformation, a process often underlined by vegetarianism and the concern for the rights of animals and the environment. Those most committed seem to seek this change and adopt new attitudes that contribute to the formation of a new self. For most interlocutors, the result of a growth in self-observation leads to greater self-reflexivity, which is represented by an increased awareness of the urban way of life, of the repression imposed on one's true needs and desires, of the dominant male culture, of traditional religions and the religious institutions for deviating from true spirituality in exchange for power, influence, and money, of biomedicine and the so-called conventional psychotherapies. In the classical Yoga Sutras, Patanjali appears to have examined the religious system of his time and culture to assemble an effective contemplative technique into an integrated approach. In this way, the Yoga Sutras could be viewed as a manual that is both agnostic and pluralistic. It offers the paradoxical possibility of a secular spirituality. This means that they provide a neutral perspective in terms of religious doctrine and can be used more as a practical applied developmental psychology than as a religious or metaphysical system. Based on this approach, yoga and meditation have been studied in the field of the medical sciences, especially in psychology and neurology. But here, I try to show that these practices have a broader meaning and should be analyzed through diverse fields and perspectives. So I present an anthropological view of the contemporary issues of becoming aware of habitual social roles and attaining mental balance. I will first focus on the mental process and impressions. According to classical yoga traditions, the superimposed condition of self-identity is the cause of impending dissatisfaction or sorrow. It is discarded with the continued practice when there is no purpose for the further production of mental impressions. This process of cessation and goal of yoga means that the seed of ignorance, the root of affliction, has been eliminated. Yoga as a spiritual process of emancipation takes place within the framework of being aware of misidentification and superimposition. Through a series of yogic transformations, it consists of a de-identification of self-identity with phenomenal existence. The practices are seen as bringing people against the force of habits, of set attitudes and dispositions. As the mind is not separate from the body, habits cannot be changed at will. We are the habits. So changing our habits depends on learning and practicing new techniques. There must be great concentration to overcome the powerful urges of the body and mind. In this sense, the practice appears to increase people's ability to hold attention during periods of physical and mental challenge, like practicing yoga and meditation. Being able to focus rather than being distracted by the thoughts that press upon oneself, including the thought of quitting, makes the normal outward orientation of the yogi's attention be turned inwards. This is in line with the ultimate aim of yoga, which would be the ceasing of the fluctuations of the mind and the attempt to control or restrain mental fluctuations. They understand that attitude patterns of how a person thinks need to change. This is done so in order to create a state of being directly connected to the body. So most interlocutors believe that especially negative thought processes end up becoming a habit. Some interlocutors engage in a fight against the notion that their thoughts are uncontrollable. When choosing to have more control, they understand that repetitive and unconscious thoughts produce automatic behavior patterns. These patterns are almost involuntary, and their attitudes end up becoming part of the same unconscious and predictable patterns. When paying attention to their thoughts, as they learn to control emotions and desires, I try to understand the transformations they undergo when becoming aware of unconscious roles and habitual behaviors. I wonder what the consequences might be in trying to change not only one's behaviors, but creeds, values, attitudes, and humor. Their main concern might be linked to reflexivity, the efficacy of meditation, and choosing where to place their attention. But I focus on the efforts towards the achievement of this mental state and the meanings attributed to the cessation of their most natural way of thinking and feeling. Now I will say a few words about the perspective of the interlocutors. For Laura, the goal of living a life of yoga involves the discipline of self-observation, watching her interactions as if they were happening to someone else. This occurs by developing a witness consciousness, detached from the ego, as they say. This witness consciousness is in the form of a self. This self would watch her life without identifying with experiences or personalizing what happens to her. According to James, it is only when he starts examining who is living within him that he can identify his ego self. He's then able to observe how this ego self reacts in each unfolding interaction. Most interlocutors perform these exercises with the aim of being able to achieve freedom from suffering. So first, it is important to understand in which ways they conceive suffering. According to what they learned from Professor Arieta, suffering is an experience of pain, aversion, and unpleasantness. It results from people's embodied experiences, like aging or illness, their perception of harm or threats of harm, they constructed understanding of change, uncertainty, contradictory impulses and desires, also the need to control their realities via their beliefs, projections, and discrepancies between what they desire and how they live. As such, suffering is seen when people wrongly imagine that life as they reorchestrate it is more worthy of being lived. Hence, they would lose considerable energy wanting to transform reality so that it corresponds to their plans, their ideals, and their beliefs. And it is by learning to focus their attention on how they respond, how they react, and how they entangle to one another that they claim to overcome suffering by being accountable for their impact. In this respect, it is important to recognize that the awareness cultivated through yoga practices is grounded in relationship. By speaking, listening, and responding, practitioners create new ways of understanding their interactions and begin to unlearn old, tired, and habitual communication patterns. Lisa argues that to attain mental balance, she needs to pay attention to her attitudes. More importantly, to be aware of attached habitual thought. Many interlocutors understand that one's attitudes create a state of connection to the body. And then when people change the patterns of how they act and how they think, these new thought patterns or attitudes can change their state of being. Lisa, for example, tries to do this by breaking free of habitual cycles of thinking and feeling. According to Peter, in order to change his attitudes, he starts by seeking to be aware of his thoughts, striving to make a conscious effort to observe his automatic mental attitudes. Another practitioner, Mara, revealed that her habitual thoughts are not always to be trusted. Trying to understand Mara's and the other practitioners' statements, I looked through research about habitual and automatic thoughts and found the work of Joe Dispenza. The author demonstrates that most persistent habitual inner statements are not true just because they come to mind. So here I decided to look at the narratives of my interviews, taking into account the experiences of Dispenza interlocutors. Those are people who overcame physical disabilities, such as paralysis, resulting from an accident. They had to struggle with the notion that their thoughts were uncontrollable. Instead, they chose to have more control over them. Based on Dispenza's research, I understand interlocutors' automatic inner statements as ideas they make up and start believing until these become a habit. This suggests that conscious thoughts, often repeated, become unconscious thinking. Most practitioners I interviewed said they tried their best to tackle the notion that their thoughts can be controlled. They choose to have more control of their thinking. It is understood it would take awareness and effort to break the cycle of a thinking process that has become unconscious, being necessary to step out of one's routines, and through contemplation and self-reflection, it is hoped that people might become aware of their unconscious scripts. So in trying to observe these thoughts without responding to them, it is then possible to seize the automatic responses that produce habitual behavior. We have seen that practitioners come to develop a level of self-awareness, and that these enable them to observe their own thinking. So in the practice of trying to have more control over their thoughts, it's all about learning to see their self as separate from their thinking process and manage it to have more agency over it. But according to these premises, I wonder what the consequences might be in trying to change one's patterns of behavior. Practitioners say it is possible to change one's most natural way of thinking and feeling, but it is important to note they understand it takes will and mental effort to increase conscious attention and to allow a new and unusual mind pattern to be adjusted to one's identity. According to Laura, to think and act out not of one's most natural emotions and behaviors is seen as the internal order beginning to listen to one's conscious mind. The modern practice of self-study, or swadhyaya, involves trying to look deeply at who a person is as a tool to move towards learning about one's strengths and weaknesses. This is done in order to question beliefs and challenge assumptions and reactions. Swadhyaya requires asking how often one's reactions are habitual and derived from distraction, how much of the day a person spends in autopilot, what patterns of interaction one returns to again and again, and if these patterns are helping yogis to learn about themselves and others, if their ways of interacting are bringing about greater concentration and greater connection, or are these interactions disconnecting them from others? In what situations and interactions do they react negatively and why? And how their reactions impact others? What patterns in their life need changing? And what are some ways they might approach to change these patterns? Researchers call the method of swadhyaya de-identification or detachment from a fixed sense of self, of thoughts, sensations, and feelings. Some yogis describe a process of de-identification as a form of rethinking emotions and habits from the point of view of a cultivated unity of their body and mind. Other practitioners talk about detachment from their ego self and ego thinking, trying to change habitual attitudes. This is done by analyzing these attitudes while seeing reality through a witness consciousness. Others try to stay still and try not to internalize their thoughts and actions. They aim to reach a kind of self-awareness through the witnessness of the habitual nature of unconscious and embodied thoughts and actions. At the same time, we can observe a bodily change related to the physical and mental practice of yoga and meditation, which works as a kind of construction of the self. In this way, it seems to involve a particular knowledge of the body and mind built upon disciplined skills and internal mastery. On that account, it enables the construction of a new self and, accordingly, a new culture. Yoga asceticism requires the constant attempt to be aware of one's attitudes. This is done by accepting what the consciousness or cosmic order brings, an understanding that everything that happens has meaning and is in consonance with this order. The acceptance or submission to the cosmic order seems to come together with the rejection of the notion of the person as a unity. This notion introjects the concept of a plural and flexible person, not only through the Atman-Brahman analogy, but also in the sense of the representation and expression of different roles and desires. The yogic construction of a yogic ethos then takes shape in relations with the community of practitioners who elaborate their identities by adopting new knowledge, new value systems, new diets, and new clothing, and new worldviews. A change that involves engagement and is based on a process of sacralization of traditions, sacralization of teachers, and sacralizations of the community of practitioners. Their new patterns of speech and behavior involve the creation of a new lifestyle and habitus. And this points to what can be compared to a religious conversion, transforming their subjectivities in a gradual process. The transformation of the self often leads to a type of yogic devotion, a continuous process of acceptance of situations and events. Each action is seen as a form of meditation that enables the participation of a more comprehensive agency. For many, the concepts of karma and reincarnation offer a way of looking at their trajectories as part of a larger plan, the cosmic order, In this perspective, the person is seen as inherently connected to a more than human universe. Reinterpretations of their own trajectories are ways of building identities, which are significantly created through interconnections with the guru, with nature, and with others. Their choices can be understood as resulting from a metaphysical scheme in which narratives of transformation are part of the reconstruction of the self as relational and connected. This lecture has attempted to show that the yogic self does not constitute a passive entity. It is built in terms of the active processes by which practitioners come to construct it. Through the practices of self-study and self-mastery, it was seen that their selves become more flexible, changeable, and revisable as a result of an increased self-observation. For most interlocutors, this leads to greater self-reflexivity. Yoga and meditation seem to be able to form and construct the old and the new self, changing concepts, changing values, and changing the cultures in which these selves function. This change occurs by way of transforming the practitioner's thoughts and behaviors. Their identity and sense of being are re-evaluated by the construction of an altered sense of body awareness. This is created by the performance of disciplinary intentions, as the body and the mind are strengthened and trained time after time by cycle upon cycle of repetitive practice. As some attempt to change their ego self-identity, they seem to pursue a self which is free of conditioning. But it is crucial to emphasize that there is always a tension between the ideal of acting and thinking in a particular way and what attitudes are actually possible to be aware of on a daily basis. On the one hand, these practices stimulate the emergence of a series of emotional and cognitive experiences. On the other hand, they consist of a process of body and mind discipline in which control over these experiences is also learned. But they are a part of a break from previous religious patterns. Those are characterized by a devaluation of mystical experience which came together with the secularization process. So the practices analyzed here could be seen as expanding the possibilities of building self-image to unexpected levels, acquiring through this process a feeling of greater power in relation to which each one can be. These exercises can be seen as enabling a sense of agency and empowerment. Through those, interlocutors see themselves as more capable of becoming conscious of habitual thoughts and enhancing the feelings of belonging. However, this empowerment seems to comprise the submission to norms, values, hierarchies, rules, traditions, and institutions of the group. As a result, this process inscribes its identity mark on the body of practitioners. The tensions involved in these identity constructions and the kind of agency they embody are seen as a contradiction at a time when it is important to find oneself and to live according to one's own parameters, instead of surrendering to conformity with an imposed model, as Charles Taylor says. We see here a culture that produces practitioners who express this tradition in the body and through it, an embodiment of tradition that manifests itself as the essence of oneself and that gives meaning to them. We can say that the culture of yoga traditions is both manifest and latent, for it never appears as external to the body it subjects. I observe there are norms regarding eating habits, rules about relating to the guru, and appropriate behavior. But these seem to reflect a creative experience of transformation through the adoption of new attitudes and behaviors. The assimilation of these rules inhabits the body of practitioners through an incorporated creativity. This results from a feeling of cultivated belonging that reconstructs the collective identity. This sense of collectivity is also present when they take into account the agency of a cosmic order or consciousness. This can be seen as bringing down one's ego, also as providing a feeling of recognition that they are not completely responsible for all that happens with them. There is a dependency when they lean on the order of events, and there is a lack of autonomy when they take into account this broader agency. This is something that contrasts with the primacy in the individual prevalent in the new spiritualities studies. There is a tendency to project the model of spiritual individualism in these studies. Colin Campbell, Robert Bella, and colleagues, and Susan Newcomb, this author presuppose an autonomous and individual behavior to the logic of free choice. This type of analysis of the phenomenon of spirituality should be questioned. I argue that spirituality shows difference and nuances with secular individualism, seeming to consolidate more tangled concepts of subjectivity. These concepts suppose different forms of mediation and sacred presence. In the narratives of self-transformation, I notice a reinvention of the self, a change that is valued in the direction of perfection, a subjective change accompanied by bodily transformation. The construction of a yogic self includes weaving new relationships, deconstructing the old self, and through complex process of subjectification, integrating the practitioner into this new culture. I argue that to live a life of yoga bears a broader meaning, whose aim, self-realization, is far wider than a bodily discipline. While there is an attempt to attain integration of body and mind, transcendence and immanence, self and other, practitioners try to become aware of habitual social roles. And when conscious of the process of building self-image, they make use of these practices as a means to relativize this construction. Thank you.